I knew something shady was going on the minute I walked out back and saw my pool nearly empty. It was 7 in the morning, and instead of the usual glimmering water, I saw a sad puddle at the deep end. For a second, I thought maybe there'd been a leak. But then I noticed the garden hose hooked up to the pump, only it wasn't mine. It was one of those cheap green hoses you buy in bulk. Someone had drained my pool. My name's Ronan Grady, and I moved to Windbrook Estates for a quiet life after retiring from 20 years in the fire department. I fixed up the house, installed a pool, and figured I'd enjoy some peace. What I didn't count on was the HOA, or more specifically, Karren Chadwick. Karren, the HOA president, was the kind of woman who thought laminated rules were more sacred than the Constitution. She was in her mid-50s, always wore a visor, and had the kind of voice that could scrape paint off a wall. She'd already fined me for overly reflective solar lights and claimed my American flag was improperly mounted. But this was something else. I stormed over to her house, which was right across the street, and pounded on the door. She opened it, already dressed in her usual beige windbreaker and fake pearls. "Good morning, Mr. Grady," she said, way too chipper. "Did you drain my pool?" She blinked like I'd asked if she knew how to fly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Someone hooked up a hose to my pump and emptied it overnight. You're the only one who's complained about it being an eyesore." Her lips curled into that tight little fake smile. "Ronan, your pool violates HOA aesthetic standards. It was never approved by the board. It was already there when I bought the place. You signed off on the remodel last year. Well, we've since revised our bylaws." My blood boiled. "So you broke into my backyard and drained it." "I have no idea what you're accusing me of," she said, and shut the door in my face. I wasn't about to let this slide. I had a Ring camera installed on the back patio. I pulled the footage, and sure enough, there she was, at 2 in the morning, climbing over my fence like some suburban cat burglar. She hooked up the hose herself, then sat on a lawn chair with a flashlight and a thermos while the water drained out. I copied the footage onto a USB and drove straight to the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty, a younger guy named Marcus, watched the footage and let out a low whistle. "She really did that. Yep, that's Karren Chadwick, HOA president. She trespassed and vandalized my property." He nodded. "This is enough to file criminal trespassing charges. Want to press them?" "Absolutely." He got the paperwork started, and I made sure to include the footage in the report. By the time I got home, word had already started spreading. Mrs. Langley from 3 doors down waved me over as I got out of my truck. "Did I hear right? Karren drained your pool?" she asked. "You heard right, and I filed charges." She laughed. "About time someone stood up to her." That night I checked the HOA website. Karren had posted a smug message about unauthorized structures being handled proactively. But by morning, that post vanished, and so did Karren's grin when a county sheriff knocked on her door with a summons in hand. The morning after the sheriff delivered the summons, the usual stillness on Sycamore Drive was replaced with something else: quiet tension. Neighbors who normally waved and watered their lawns in peace were suddenly lingering on sidewalks, whispering in pairs, peeking through curtains. Karren's house, with its over-trimmed hedges and perpetually spotless driveway, had become the neighborhood's new epicenter of curiosity. I stood on my porch with a mug of black coffee, watching as a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled into her driveway. Out stepped a man in a gray blazer. He knocked once before Karren opened the door. They didn't speak on the porch, just walked inside. I figured it was a lawyer. Good. She was going to need one. Later that day, I drove into town to meet with Deputy Marcus again. He'd called to say the county prosecutor was interested in pursuing the case more aggressively. When I walked into his office, he was already flipping through a folder. "We pulled HOA permit records going back 5 years, he said, not looking up. "Turns out, Karren's name is on a lot of approvals, some of them for things she didn't have authority to sign off on." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" 2 pool removals, 4 fence height variances, 1 tree removal permit that never went through the city. And all of them were signed without board votes. That's not how it's supposed to work. "So she's been faking board approvals," he nodded. "Looks that way. We're compiling more evidence, but your case, that's the tipping point. The trespassing charge opened the door. Now we're looking into misuse of position, falsifying documents, and property destruction. I leaned back in the chair. She's been running this place like a private fiefdom, not for much longer. Back at home, I noticed something new on Karren's porch, a clipboard hanging from the door handle. I crossed the street and took a closer look. It was a petition, not from her but from the residents. The title read, "Motion to remove Karren Chadwick from Windbrook Estates Board of Directors." Beneath it were over 20 signatures. As I stood there reading, Donnie McClure walked up. He lived on the corner and ran a small landscaping business. Always wore paint-splattered jeans and a cap that said, "Mo Money." "She tried to fine me $200 last month for having a bag of fertilizer visible in my garage," he said, shaking his head. I told her to shove it. Then she doubled the fine. I signed it. She's been doing this to a lot of people. Man, she fined Mrs. Patel for a wind chime, said it was a noise violation. It barely makes a sound. I think she just picks random targets. I signed the petition and walked away feeling something I hadn't felt since my last station call momentum. 2 days later, I got a call from the county prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elena Ruiz. She wanted to meet in person. We sat down in her office, which was stacked with binders and court filings. "Your incident opened a can of worms," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of forged meeting minutes, altered vote tallies, and even an email chain between Karren and someone named Arnold Tibbins, her cousin, apparently who'd been awarded a landscaping contract under the table. "She's been steering HOA funds to family?" I asked. "Yes." "And billing the HOA for work that was never done. Over $15,000 in fabricated landscaping invoices between June and October last year. Does that fall under embezzlement?" "Absolutely." "We're preparing to issue a subpoena for her financial records, and we've already frozen the HOA's discretionary fund until we finish the audit." I let out a low whistle. "You think the board knew?" Ruiz shook her head. "Not all of them. We've interviewed 2 members who claim their signatures were forged on budget approvals." I left the office that day with a clear sense of where things were headed and a growing list of neighbors who'd started stopping by my house just to talk. People I barely knew before were suddenly showing up with old HOA letters, asking if they could share their complaints too. I told them to write everything down in detail: names, dates, amounts. I bought a filing box and started organizing them by category. By the end of the week, I had nearly 30 statements, some describing fines for non-existent violations, others alleging threats of liens over unpaid dues that had already been paid. One veteran, Mr. Dorsey, said she threatened to report him to the city for illegal flag placement after he refused to mow his lawn during a heat wave. He was 79 and recovering from hip surgery. I handed everything over to Ruiz's office. That Friday, Karren's house was visited by 3 unmarked vehicles. Plainclothes investigators entered with a warrant and emerged 2 hours later with several boxes. One of them carried out her desktop computer. By the following Monday, a notice was posted on the HOA bulletin board. An emergency meeting had been called. The location was moved to the local community center to accommodate the turnout. That night, the place was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the air buzzed with barely contained energy. I stood in the back next to Mrs. Langley and Donnie. Up front, a temporary moderator, a local attorney named Gail Withers, stepped up to the podium. Due to an ongoing criminal investigation involving the current HOA president, this board has voted to suspend all powers held by Karren Chadwick pending further legal proceedings. The room erupted in applause. We are also initiating a full forensic audit and inviting residents to submit any documentation or complaints regarding HOA conduct over the past 5 years. Someone shouted, "Start with the fake tree removals." Laughter followed, but it was the kind that comes after a storm, that collective exhale when people realize they weren't crazy, they weren't alone, and they weren't powerless. Karren didn't show up that night. Her porch light stayed off and her driveway was empty. Later that week, a moving truck pulled up. She didn't wave goodbye, didn't even step outside, just left. I got a call from Deputy Marcus a few days later. The charges were moving forward. In addition to trespassing and property damage, she was now facing counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Her cousin Arnold had flipped to avoid charges of his own, providing emails and bank records that sealed the case. The pool was the least of it in the end. But it had been the first crack in the dam, and me. I didn't want to be on the board, but the neighborhood asked me to be part of the new oversight committee. I said yes. Not because I wanted power, but because I'd seen what happened when the wrong person had too much of it. We'd been quiet for too long. Now we were wide awake. A week after Karren left Windbrook Estates under the weight of criminal charges and a shattered reputation, things started to settle, at least on the surface. The HOA board had installed a temporary leadership structure, and Gail Withers, the attorney who moderated the emergency meeting, was appointed as interim president. She wasn't flashy, didn't talk down to anyone, and most importantly, didn't seem interested in using the HOA as her personal kingdom. That alone won her the trust of half the neighborhood in under 3 days. But the thing about messes like the one Karren left behind is that they don't just vanish when the person does. They leave trails: paper, digital, financial. And when I got a knock on my door from Elena Ruiz herself, holding a laptop bag and looking more serious than I'd seen her before, I figured something bigger was about to break. "We need to talk," she said, stepping into my living room. "There's something we missed." She opened her laptop on my kitchen table and pulled up a spreadsheet. It looked like a mess of numbers, but she pointed to a tab labeled Vendor Reimbursements. In the column next to Arnold Tibbins' name, there were other entries, names unknown to me, with company titles that barely sounded real. One was Pinecrest Safety Auditing, another Northwind Community Enhancements. "These are shell companies," Elena said. "We traced the bank accounts. All of them lead back to one central account opened under a fake name, Darla Knox. The address used on the application was a P.O. box rented by an assistant clerk from the HOA's admin office. Name's Tricia Vane." I narrowed my eyes. "She's the one who always handed out the violation notices, wore those butterfly glasses. Never said more than 2 words. She's also the one who processed all the vendor payments," Elena said. "And here's the kicker, she's not just complicit. She's the one who set up the financial structure. Karren executed it, sure, but Tricia built it." The scale of it was staggering. Over $60,000 siphoned through fake inspections, landscaping upgrades, and non-existent safety audits. All paid out over the course of 2 years. Elena clicked through more documents, emails, deposit slips, even a scanned copy of a notebook Tricia had kept. It was a ledger, handwritten and obsessively detailed, listing every fraudulent invoice, every kickback, and which board member supposedly approved them. Most of the signatures were forged. "This is more than HOA misconduct," I said, stunned. "You're talking about organized fraud." "We've already filed for a grand jury," Elena said. "Between the forged documents, the money trail, and the unauthorized access to private properties, we're looking at conspiracy, wire fraud, and possibly racketeering. And we believe Tricia's still in town." That night, I walked through the neighborhood with a new purpose. Any illusion that the corruption began and ended with Karren was gone. I spotted Tricia's car parked 2 streets over, near the tennis courts. She hadn't shown up to any of the recent meetings, and no one had seen her since the audit was announced. I wasn't law enforcement, but I knew how to gather information. Old habits from my firehouse days came back, knowing when to ask, when to listen. I stopped by the house of Vince Choi, one of the newer residents and a tech consultant who'd recently installed a set of high-end security cameras around his property after someone slashed his tires last month. "Got footage from the last few nights?" I asked him. He nodded. "I've got motion-triggered night logs." "Why?" "Looking for a pattern. A vehicle, possibly someone making late-night drop-offs or pickups. Think you could pull the last week?" He didn't ask questions. By the next evening, we were reviewing the footage in his garage on a wall-mounted monitor. Sure enough, Tricia's car appeared multiple times, always after midnight. Once, she parked near the maintenance shed behind the HOA clubhouse, stayed for 20 minutes, then left carrying a box. We called Deputy Marcus that night. The search warrant came fast. By the next morning, the maintenance shed was swarming with county officers and investigators. What they found was worse than anyone expected: stacks of shredded documents stuffed into garbage bags, a disconnected hard drive hidden under a loose floorboard, and a locked file cabinet containing HOA checks dated months into the future. Some were already filled out. All were signed with forged signatures of former board members. Elena called me that afternoon. "We're officially treating this as an orchestrated fraud ring," she said. "Tricia was arrested this morning. She had a burner phone on her and over $2,000 in cash. We believe she was preparing to flee." The news spread like wildfire. By sunset, neighbors were gathering again, this time outside the clubhouse, not in anger, but in stunned disbelief. People who had written off their fines, ignored their hunches, or felt bullied into silence were finally saying it out loud. They'd been manipulated, exploited. Donnie showed up holding a manila envelope. "Found this behind my shed," he said, handing it to me. "Thought it was junk at first. Opened it. It's a report: safety violation citations filed under a fake inspector's name. Dates don't match anything I ever received. Inside were copies of forms, all bearing the name Cliff Reynolds. No one by that name had ever been employed by the HOA. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Elena's office confirmed that Tricia had created multiple aliases and even coordinated with a data entry contractor from a third-party management company to falsify HOA records. They'd fabricated resident complaints to justify fines. That's how Karren had targeted specific properties. She'd had a system. A manufactured complaint would trigger a violation, the violation would lead to a fine, and the fine would be followed by a lien threat. And if the homeowner complained, the records would show that a neighbor had filed the original complaint. Most of those neighbors either didn't exist or had never submitted anything. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Psychological, financial, and social control over the entire neighborhood. 3 days after Tricia's arrest, a formal statement was issued by the district attorney's office. Karren, already out on bail for the initial charges, was now being re-indicted under expanded counts. Tricia faced 9 felony charges. The contractor who helped falsify records was cooperating in exchange for leniency. Windbrook Estates had become a case study in HOA corruption. Local news vans showed up. A city council member requested access to the investigation documents to propose new oversight laws for HOAs across the county. And Gail Withers, now confirmed as the official new president, announced a complete reworking of the HOA charter, including a clause that prevented any future board member from holding position for more than 1 term without a 75% resident vote. I stood in the back of that meeting hall, arms folded, watching people I'd barely known 2 months ago stand up and speak without fear. They weren't just residents now, they were a community. And I realized something I hadn't before. Karren hadn't just drained my pool. She drained the trust, the goodwill, and the spirit of the neighborhood. But in doing so, she'd also exposed herself and all the rot she'd built her petty empire on. And while the pool would take another week to refill, the neighborhood was already full again in a way that mattered a whole lot more. 2 weeks after the arrests, the neighborhood was unrecognizable in the best way. The tension that had once coiled tight beneath every HOA notice and unreturned email had unraveled. Lawns still got mowed, fences still got painted, but now people did it while chatting across property lines instead of hiding behind them. No more secret fines, no more whisper campaigns. But just when we thought the worst was behind us, a new thread emerged, one that made everything that came before look like amateur hour. It began when a quiet, retired accountant named Evelyn Monroe stopped me during my morning walk and handed me an envelope. "I was going through old HOA mail," she said. "Found this stuffed inside a billing statement. Thought you'd want to see it." Inside was a typed notice, not threatening, not a fine. Just a summary of pending legal actions against 8 properties in Windbrook Estates, none of which had ever been listed in the HOA minutes. There was a line that caught my eye. Foreclosure proceedings initiated via Expedited Assessment Lien Protocol per Clause 14b. I'd read the bylaws backward and forward by now. There was no Clause 14b. There wasn't even a Section 14. I thanked Evelyn and took it straight to Gail Withers. "That's not even formatted like our official documents," she said, scanning it. "And look at the date. That's from 7 months ago. Who signed off on it?" "No one. There's no signature, just a printed name. Compliance Officer C. Reynolds, that name again, Cliff Reynolds." The same alias used in the fake inspection reports. Gail sat back, her brow furrowed. "You think they tried to foreclose on people's homes using fake documents? It didn't take long to find out." Gail called an emergency meeting with the county recorder's office. They pulled records for the 8 properties listed. 6 had liens filed against them, real ones, but they were filed under a limited liability company called WBE Asset Recovery Partners. The listed agent, Darla Knox, Elena Ruiz, called me that evening. "They didn't just fabricate fines," she said. "They tried to seize property." I was stunned. "Are those filings still active?" "Not for long. We're working with the state attorney general now. This crossed into real estate fraud, and that brings in a whole new set of charges. We're talking federal oversight." Turns out, Tricia and Karren had set up WBE Asset Recovery Partners a year into their scheme. Using forged violations and fake lien notices, they'd pushed residents into believing their homes were at risk. Then, through the LLC, they'd file quiet lien claims, ones that didn't show up in the HOA's books, but were legally recorded through the county clerk, using manipulated paperwork and a complicit notary they had on payroll. One homeowner, a single mother named Lydia who worked nights at the hospital, had received a letter saying her home would be auctioned if she didn't pay over $9,000 in accumulated assessments. She never told anyone, thinking it was her fault. She'd taken out a second job to pay it. When we showed her the forged documents, she broke down. "I thought I was about to lose my house," she said. "I didn't even know I could fight it." Elena assured her and the others that the state had begun the process to void every fraudulent lien. The notary involved was arrested 2 towns over. The full operation was being handed over to the state fraud division, and the charges expanded to include attempted theft of real property, forgery of public records, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Meanwhile, the HOA fund was being audited by a third-party firm brought in by the county. What they found was staggering: over $120,000 in misappropriated funds, most of it laundered through fake service contracts and pocketed by Tricia, Karren, and their inner circle. The community center hosted a town hall that week. This time, the place was packed wall to wall, not with outrage but with determination. Gail stood at the front with a folder of proposed reforms, but before she could even speak, Evelyn Monroe raised her hand and walked to the front. Her voice was steady. "We were lied to, stolen from, intimidated. But we're not victims. We're homeowners, and it's time we act like it." She proposed the formation of a rotating oversight committee of residents, no more than 5, no less than 3, who would review every financial transaction, contract, and vote the board made. Not just transparency, but accountability. The crowd approved it unanimously. I didn't say much that night. Watching people who'd once been isolated by fear now standing shoulder to shoulder, I figured the neighborhood was doing just fine. But one last thing needed to happen before we could close the door on all this: the court date. It was mid-morning when I walked into the county courthouse. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a sharp gaze, listened patiently as Elena laid out the full scope of the crimes. Karren sat at the defense table, her attorney whispering furiously in her ear. Tricia was led in separately, her hands cuffed, her expression flat. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of forged signatures, testimonies from victims. Financial records tracing stolen funds directly to their bank accounts. When the judge handed down her ruling, the courtroom fell into a hush. To Miss Chadwick and Miss Vane, she said, "You abused positions of trust to exploit, defraud, and attempt to steal the very homes of the people you swore to serve. Your actions were calculated, cruel, and corrosive to the fabric of your community." It is the judgment of this court that you serve no less than 12 years in state prison, with no eligibility for parole for the first 8. Restitution will be ordered in full. You are hereby remanded to state custody. Neither woman said a word as they were let out. Karren looked back only once, her face blank, her power gone. The judge turned to the gallery. To the residents of Windbrook Estates, this court commends your courage in bringing these crimes to light. Let this be a reminder that no individual, no matter their title, is above the law. Outside the courthouse, press gathered. Some of the residents gave brief statements. One of the younger families, the Nguyens, held up a handmade sign that read, "This is our home." Not theirs. Back at Windbrook, things changed quickly. The HOA bylaws were rewritten from the ground up. Fines were no longer issued without a real vote. Contracts were posted publicly for review. Gail stepped down once the reforms were passed, handing the reins to a new board made up of residents with real experience in law, accounting, and construction. I kept my spot on the oversight committee, not because I enjoyed it, but because I knew what could happen if no one watched. One evening, as the sun set over the backyards and newly repaired fences, I finally refilled my pool. This time, I left the gate open. Neighbors wandered in with lawn chairs and coolers. Kids splashed in the water. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker and played old rock classics. No one talked about Karren. No one had to. The neighborhood had taken its power back. And this time, it wasn't going anywhere.